Right now, you can walk into a supermarket, pick up a loaf of bread, a bag of rice, a handful of apples, and enough food to feed your family for the next week. You probably won't stop to wonder where any of it came from, because food doesn't feel like something you find anymore. It feels like something that's simply there, waiting. But for almost every human who has ever lived, there are no supermarkets, no farms, no wheat fields stretching across the horizon, no orchards, no barns filled with grain. If you wanted dinner, you had to go into the wilderness and hope it was still there. Miss today, and tomorrow becomes much more complicated. Think about that. For nearly 300,000 years, humans survived without planting a single seed. And then, around 10,000 years ago, something changed. Across different parts of the world, people slowly stopped chasing food and started growing it instead. It sounds like one of the greatest ideas our species ever had. Grow your own food. Stay in one place. Never go hungry again. Except that's not what happened. The first farmers worked longer hours, ate fewer kinds of food, got sick more often. Their teeth rotted faster. Their bones carried the marks of exhausting physical labor. In many ways, their lives became harder. So why would anyone abandon a lifestyle that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years? Why trade freedom for fields? To answer that, you have to imagine a world before agriculture existed at all. For most of human history, your ancestors never stayed anywhere for very long. They couldn't. Food moved, so they moved too. In spring, they followed herds across open grasslands. During summer, they gathered berries, fruits, and edible plants. Autumn meant nuts, seeds, and migrating birds. Winter demanded something else entirely. Every season rewrote the map. Their home wasn't a village. It was an entire landscape. And despite what many people imagine, they weren't wandering aimlessly. Hunter-gatherers knew their environment with astonishing precision. They remembered where fresh water appeared after heavy rain, which valleys ripened with wild berries first, where fish gathered during spawning season, which trees produced edible nuts, and which ones could kill you. This knowledge wasn't written down. It lived inside people's memories, passed from one generation to the next. The landscape itself became a library, and every journey was another lesson. Now here's something that surprises many archaeologists. Hunter-gatherers often ate an extraordinary variety of foods, not dozens, sometimes hundreds. Depending on where they lived, a single community might eat fish from nearby rivers, shellfish from the coast, wild grains, berries, roots, nuts, honey, birds, deer, wild cattle, or whatever the season happened to provide. Dinner changed constantly. That diversity mattered, because if one food disappeared, another usually took its place. A failed berry season wasn't a disaster if fish were plentiful. A poor hunting week wasn't the end if roots and nuts remained abundant. Nature spread the risk. But here's the thing. That system only works as long as nature stays predictable. And about 12,000 years ago, predictability disappeared. Everything was about to change. Around 11,700 years ago, the Earth entered a completely different chapter. The last ice age came to an end. For tens of thousands of years before that, the climate had been wildly unstable. Cold periods arrived without warning. Rainfall shifted. Entire ecosystems disappeared. Animals followed the changing seasons, and humans followed them. But as the glaciers retreated, something unusual happened. The climate became warmer, more stable. Year after year, the seasons started behaving the way seasons do today. That might not sound revolutionary. It was because plants suddenly had something they hadn't enjoyed for a very long time. Consistency. Across the Fertile Crescent, a broad region stretching through modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey, wild wheat and barley began growing in extraordinary abundance. Not everywhere, but in enormous natural patches. Imagine walking through a valley and finding enough wild grain to feed your family for weeks, then returning the following year and finding it there again. The landscape had become predictable, and people noticed. For thousands of years, people weren't farmers. They were collectors. Every summer, They harvested wild cereals that nobody had planted. They cut the stalks with stone blades, carried them home in baskets, ground the seeds into flour using heavy stones, and baked simple flatbreads over hot rocks. Long before agriculture, people were already eating bread. Think about that. The earliest bread we know of is older than farming itself. At a site in northeastern Jordan called Shabaka 1, archaeologists discovered tiny charred crumbs of flatbread dating to around 14,400 years ago. That's roughly 4,000 years before the first domesticated wheat appeared. These weren't farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. Yet they were already gathering wild grain, grinding it, mixing it with roots, and baking it over fire. Which raises an obvious question. If people already had bread, why bother inventing farming? Here's where it gets really interesting. Archaeologists call these people the Natufians. Beginning around 15,000 years ago, communities across the Levant started doing something their ancestors rarely had. They stayed put, not forever, but long enough to build stone houses, storage pits, communal hearths, cemeteries. These weren't cities, but they weren't temporary camps either. They occupied the same places year after year because the surrounding landscape was unusually rich. Wild gazelle migrated nearby. Oak forests produced nuts. Wild cereals covered the hillsides. For the first time, nature offered enough food for people to settle down without planting anything. It looked like the perfect arrangement, except it depended on one fragile assumption, that the climate would never change again. It did. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures suddenly plunged. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas. In only a few decades, many regions became colder and much drier. The wild cereal fields that Natufian communities depended on began shrinking. Gazelle herds changed their migration routes. Reliable harvests became unreliable. The people who had settled beside nature's pantry suddenly discovered the pantry wasn't full anymore, and moving away wasn't as simple as it once had been. They had houses, storage pits, burial grounds, generations of memories tied to one place. So instead of following the food, they tried something humanity had never attempted before. They began helping the food grow. That tiny experiment would eventually reshape the entire planet. Nobody woke up one morning and announced, "Today, we're inventing agriculture." History almost never works like that. The first farmers probably didn't even realize they were farming. Imagine returning to the same campsite every year. You harvest wild wheat. Some seeds spill on the ground. Months later, new stalks appear exactly where last year's camp stood. Maybe someone notices. Maybe they scatter a few extra seeds nearby. Maybe they clear away competing plants. Not because they're trying to change the world, but because they're trying to make next year's harvest a little easier. Small decisions, repeated for generations. That's how revolutions usually begin. Not with a single invention, with thousands of tiny improvements. Over centuries, people unknowingly began selecting the plants that worked best for them. The largest grains, the easiest plants to harvest, the stalks that stayed upright instead of scattering their seeds into the wind. Without understanding genetics, they were quietly directing evolution. The wheat was changing, and so were the people growing it. Here's what makes that finding so important. Wild wheat doesn't want to be harvested. When it ripens, the seed head shatters. The grains fall onto the ground, ready to grow wherever nature decides. That's excellent for the plant, terrible for humans. But occasionally, a rare plant held on to its seeds just a little longer. Those were the stalks people harvested most easily. And because those seeds ended up back in the ground the following year, that rare mutation slowly became common. Nobody designed it. Natural selection simply changed direction. For millions of years, plants had evolved to satisfy nature. Now, they were beginning to evolve alongside humans. By around 10,500 years ago, domesticated wheat and barley were appearing across parts of the Fertile Crescent. Soon afterward came lentils, peas, and chickpeas. Fields slowly replaced wild grasslands. The relationship between humans and food had changed forever. But the harvest came with an unexpected price. Most people imagine farming as humanity's first great upgrade. The archaeological evidence tells a much messier story. Skeletons from early farming communities reveal shorter average height, more tooth decay, more signs of childhood malnutrition, more arthritis, more worn joints, more broken backs. Why? Because farming replaced dietary diversity with dependence. Instead of eating hundreds of different foods throughout the year, many early farmers survived on just a handful of crops, mostly grain. If the harvest failed, everyone suffered together. If disease infected the crop, there was no backup plan. Hunter-gatherers spread their risk across entire landscapes. Farmers placed almost all of it into one field. Think about that. The first farmers worked harder, ate worse, and became less healthy. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why would anyone choose this life? The answer isn't found in a single person. It's found in population. Here's the mistake we often make. We assume agriculture succeeded because it made individuals richer. It didn't. It made communities larger. A successful hunting ground could support only a small number of people before the animals disappeared. A cultivated field could feed many more. Every harvest produced surplus. Every surplus allowed more children to survive. More children became more workers. More workers planted more fields. The cycle fed itself. Within only a few thousand years, villages began growing into permanent settlements. And once thousands of people started living together, history took an entirely new direction. Once people stopped moving, everything else started moving instead. Food stayed in one place. So people did too. That sounds simple. It wasn't. A hunter-gatherer camp might disappear after a few weeks. A farming village couldn't. Someone had to protect the fields. Someone had to repair houses. Someone had to guard the store grain. Because grain has one enormous advantage over fresh meat. It lasts for months, sometimes years. That changes everything. A successful hunt feeds your family today. A full granary feeds an entire village through winter. And for the first time in human history, food could be counted, measured, stored, and eventually owned. Think about that. The idea of wealth may have started with a pile of grain. Here's where it gets really interesting. Once a community could reliably produce more food than it immediately needed, not everyone had to spend every day finding dinner. Some people became builders. Others became potters, stoneworkers, weavers, traders, eventually priests, leaders, soldiers. Writing itself may have begun for an unexpectedly ordinary reason: keeping track of grain. Some of the earliest clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia weren't poems, or laws, or stories. They were accounting records. Who owned what? Who owed what? How much grain entered the storehouse? Civilization didn't begin with philosophy. It began with bookkeeping, quietly, almost accidentally. But here's the remarkable part. No single civilization taught the world how to farm. People figured it out independently. In China, communities domesticated rice and millet. In New Guinea, they cultivated taro and bananas. In Mexico, maize slowly evolved from a wild grass called teosini. In the Andes, potatoes became a staple. Across parts of Africa, people domesticated sorghum and pearl millet. Different continents, different climates, different crops. The same idea. Again and again, human beings reached the same conclusion. If nature couldn't always be trusted, perhaps it could be persuaded. So, when did humans start farming? The answer isn't simply 10,000 years ago. It began much earlier. The moment hunter-gatherers started returning to the same valleys. The moment they harvested wild grain year after year. The moment someone scattered a few extra seeds into the soil, hoping next season might be a little easier. Agriculture wasn't a single invention. It was a slow conversation between people, plants, and a changing climate. And once that conversation began, there was no going back. Fields became villages. Villages became cities. Cities became nations. Nearly every person alive today depends on a decision made by people who never imagined supermarkets, skyscrapers, or electricity. Tomorrow, you'll probably buy food again, or cook dinner, or slice a piece of bread without thinking about where it began. It won't feel like history. It'll feel like another ordinary day. But hidden inside every loaf, every bowl of rice, every ear of corn, and every potato is one of the greatest experiments our species ever attempted. An experiment that made life harder before it made civilization possible. We often say agriculture changed the world, but that's only half the story. Agriculture changed us, and every meal you eat today is still part of that experiment.